Well, our next topic today is compaction, and I think it's fitting. We're standing in a wheel track. We got major compaction right here, and right next to it, not so much. How are we going to deal with this?
Well, you know what? We get into harvest time, and everybody's in a big rush, and that includes us. We want to get that crop off safely before we have bad weather or snow or loss out in the field of any sort. And so everybody's hurrying, and we kind of forget about some of the basic things, and we drive tractors and grain carts and trucks all over the field, and we end up with things like this, where we've got a hard area where the ground has been packed down because we drove all that heavy weight over it, and now it's something that we have to address immediately. We can't wait.
Okay, well, let's talk first about minimizing the problem during harvest, then we'll talk about fixing the problem. All right, so just a few quick tips. First of all, 80% of compaction or something like that is caused by the first trip over the field. In other words, don't be driving any which way across the field with the grain cart. If you can, follow the same tracks as much as possible. That will reduce overall compaction, then you'll only have a few spots to fix anyway. The other thing is, if you can drive over the row, you're going to have a lot less compaction problem than when you drive in between the row. And now, obviously, it's up to you. It's going to be a little harder on your tires driving over the row, but all I'm telling you is if you've got roots below ground, that's going to really cushion that blow. So you will absolutely have less compaction if you can drive over a row.
One other thing you can do is just spread that weight out even more. Use bigger tires or have more tires or switch to tracks. There's a lot of ways that you can spread the pounds per square inch pressure that you're putting down onto your soil. And when you do that, just by putting on duals instead of single wheels, now you've reduced your compaction causing ability in half. And when you spread that weight out, you have less problem to deal with down the road.
Yeah, and even if there is compaction there, if you've spread the weight out, it's not going to go as deep. Okay, so if we have compaction that's going down to 20 inches, that's a lot more of a problem than if our compaction just goes down to 8 or 10 inches. And you might say, oh, I'm not going to compact something all the way down to 20 inches. Yeah, you can. If you get too much weight at any one spot, you can go way down deep in that soil. And also remember that the drier the soil is, the less problem you're going to have with this. So, you know, we've talked about some steps as far as where you drive and what you're doing with the wheel tracks and everything else. It makes so much difference if you can just wait an extra day or two and let things dry out a little bit in your field.
Wow, I'm going to record that and play it back for you here in a couple of weeks, Brad.
Well, I was just about to say, sometimes I realize you have to go, you don't have a choice. But you know what, this fall, stuff is going to be pretty dry. So we don't have to be out there instantly. If the corn's ready to go the 1st of October, we've got plenty of time to get it done, most likely. I'm just trying to tell you, don't rip up your field, because the result of creating compaction could be issues for many years to come.
Well, that's for sure. But the one I'm most worried about is next spring's crop. So if we want to have a good crop next year, we've got to deal with some of these compaction issues right now.
Oh, yeah, but one thing too, a lot of people will say, well, the freeze-thaw is going to take care of that compaction issue. Just on the other side of this section, we did a little work for a guy, some tiling, and we were going through basically a waterway. And there was the farmer who farmed that ground 20 years before him, had gotten stuck down in there. We still found those tracks from 20 years ago. We could find them when we were going through that area. I mean, freeze-thaw will only take care of a small percentage of your compaction. And why is that? Why doesn't the freeze-thaw work?
Well, I've got more examples too. There's still ruts from where the pioneers drove their wagon trains that you can find in pastures in South Dakota, in Minnesota. I mean, those things are 100 years old or more.
Okay, so why? Why doesn't freeze-thaw take it out?
Well, when you think about freeze-thaw, what is that going to do? It's really little moisture particles getting in those soil colloids and spreading them out. What happens is it will spread things out up and down, and when the thaw happens next spring, they'll just settle right back. Well, if you've got a vertical compaction that you caused with something that pressed down like a deep rut, you may lift that up and set it back down. It doesn't stretch that rut back out and break it up and make it crumble. So freeze-thaw definitely helps. There's no question about it. It helps a little bit, but it's not this big deal that's going to fix everything. As we've illustrated, there's going to be compaction out there for years and years unless you deal with it with some form of tillage, or maybe even a cover crop like we've got here.
Okay, so let's talk about that specifically. If we were going to do a cover crop, let's start there. What would we use? How long would it have to grow? What would we need to do there?
Okay, well, the important thing with cover crops is they do take time. You can't harvest your corn in mid-October in South Dakota and expect that you're going to get a cover crop to grow and correct problems for you. It's something that's going to happen after, say, winter wheat, for example, that you harvest relatively early in the summer, or maybe even spring wheat that you harvest fairly early. Then you get out and get this cover crop growing where you've hopefully got maybe as long as 3 months that you have for a growing season.
At least a couple of months. You're most likely going to need at least a couple of months. But what crop would you use?
Well, you need to select cover crops for a couple of different things. One, you don't want to have a weed problem for years to come where something goes to seed. Now all of a sudden you've got something new in your area that, wow, I can't get that under control at all. So you do need to pick something that you're going to be able to kill off eventually with the freeze or with a burn down in the fall. The next thing you need to look at though is something with a deep taproot. If you've got compaction issues out there, you need something that's going to get down and bust that thing up. Now, if you can see in this field, we've got some ruts that, wow, they were just so firmly compacted that even our cover crop didn't do a good job growing in. In this case, we're definitely going to need some tillage in this particular piece of ground.
We should have used something different. So turnips and radishes get talked about a lot, obviously alfalfa and some of the clovers. But with turnips, for example, what we had here was not the right kind of turnip, we don't think.
Well, there are some that are really tillage turnips that
Right.
get deep roots that maybe they'll
tillage
go
radishes.
8 inches deep or something like that. That'll break up a lot of this surface compaction that we're talking about here. If you've got some turnips that only get 2 or 3 inches deep, it's just not going to do that much for you because the ruts created here are going to be a lot more than just 1 inch or 2 deep.
Okay, so if you're not going to do a cover crop, what would you do in terms of tillage?
Well, there are different things that you can do, and as you mentioned, it depends on how deep those compacted areas are. Now, let's just say that you ran your pickup truck across the end of the field and it was in pretty good shape, that maybe it was only sinking in 1 inch or 2. No big deal. You know, it's not going to be very tough to take that kind of compaction out. But let's say that you ran a heavy grain cart across the field and it packed things down 12 or 14 inches deep. Now we're talking a whole different application or a whole different tillage that you're going to use.
Okay, so what a lot of guys will do is use a deep ripper, and the reason why they use that is because they can get down to that 12, 14 inch depth. But the problem with some of these deep rippers is they've got a C shank, they turn everything over, and what we find very often is all they've done is moved the compaction layer down. So they might have had compaction because of disking earlier in earlier years at 6 or 8 inches deep. Now they moved it down to 12 or 14 inches, and it's hard as a rock at 12 or 14. And when you dig a root pit, you find you have no root growth below that. So instead of using a deep ripper, what would you recommend?
Well, we'd use something like a straight shank zone commander. With a straight shank with a narrow point, you can get down much deeper in the soil profile. And now granted, you're not going to till everything up. The field isn't going to look like it was just worked. You're just going to see some strips out through that field. What we're doing is running ours at about a 30-inch spacing, and we're going down about 20 or 22 inches deep with our straight shank, and we're able to break through those compaction zones, giving our roots a nice channel to get down through the compacted
And it's amazing,
areas.
even if you plant in between where those shanks were, the roots will grow that way because roots are going to take the path of least resistance. So again, we would suggest doing something like that with a straight shank rather than using a regular deep ripper.
Well, compaction is a big problem. It will definitely harm your yields in your fields, so you need to get it taken care of this fall if you can, because in the spring you just don't know if it's going to be too wet to work that ground.
Well, another thing you don't know come spring is what you're going to have for weeds, but I'll bet you'll be seeing our Weed of the Week somewhere. Can you identify this week's weed?